The Devil at the Crossroads, the legend of Robert Johnson and the 27 Club. Now, every mystery begins with a question, but every legend begins with a whisper. For almost 100 years, there's been a story carried on the warm night air of the Mississippi Delta. Old blues musicians would sometimes speak of it after the final song had been played. Travellers shared it beneath lonely porch lights. Some refused to tell it after midnight, not because they feared the story, but because they feared who might be listening. They said there was an old crossroads somewhere along the forgotten roads of Mississippi. By day, it was nothing more than the two dusty tracks disappearing into endless cotton fields. A place so ordinary that most people would drive straight past without giving it a second glance. But when darkness settled over the Delta, the crossroads became something else. Not a place, a threshold. The old people believed that desperate men sometimes wandered there carrying more than just their dreams. Some came searching for fortune, others for revenge. A few came hoping to change their lives forever. And according to the older stories, if your desire burned brightly enough, you would not be standing there alone for very long. Whether these stories were born from faith, born from fear, or the endless imagination of generations who'd lived beneath those southern skies, history cannot tell us. But history has never been the keeper of legends. People are. And among all the stories whispered across the Mississippi Delta, none travel further than the tale of a young man, a young blues musician named Robert Johnson. They say he wasn't born with extraordinary talent, far from it. When Robert first began playing the blues, there was little to suggest that one day he would become one of the most influential musicians who had ever lived. He was determined, he was passionate, he was restless, but gifted? Few people thought so. The old blues players who filled the juke joints of Mississippi remembered a shy young man sitting quietly in the corner, watching every movement of their hands. He studied every note, every rhythm, every mistake, waiting patiently for his chance to play. And when the chance finally came, the room often reacted with uncomfortable silence. Some smiled politely, others laughed but awkwardly. A few simply walked away. There was no cruelty in it, only honesty. Robert Johnson wasn't ready. The disappointment cut deeply, but according to those who knew him, giving up was never part of his nature. Night after night he returned. Night after night he watched, listened, learned, almost as though he believed that somewhere inside every great musician there was no secret no one was willing to share. Then, one day, Robert Johnson disappeared. There was no farewell, no explanation, no dramatic final performance. He simply vanished from the Delta. Weeks became months. Some assumed he had given up music altogether. Others believed he had gone searching for work. Life moved on. The juke joints filled with familiar faces. The old songs continued until one evening Robert Johnson came home. At first, nobody paid much attention. It was the same young man, the same worn clothes, the same battered guitar slung over his shoulder, but then he began to play. The first note silenced the room. The second left seasonal musicians staring at one another in disbelief. By the third, the laughter that had once followed Robert Johnson disappeared forever. The guitar no longer sounded like an instrument, it sang. The notes seemed to bend in impossible directions. The rhythms carried a confidence that simply hadn't existed before. His fingers moved effortlessly across the strings as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Those who had mocked him now leaned forward in their chairs. Someone watched his hands, others watched his face, trying to discover what had changed. No one found an answer, because whatever happened during those missing months, Robert Johnson never spoke about it. And silence has always been fertile ground for legends. At first, people searched for extraordinary explanations. Perhaps He had found a remarkable teacher, and there is rumour of that. Perhaps months of relentless practice had transformed him, maybe. Perhaps the young musician everyone had dismissed had finally discovered the talent that had been there all along. These explanations satisfied some, but not everyone, because there was another story. Stories shared quietly. A story spoken only when strangers had left the room. A story that always began with the same words, they say. They say Robert Johnson had gone down to the Crossroads, and he hadn't gone there alone. Nobody knew who first told the story. Perhaps this is why it survived. The oldest legends rarely have a beginning, they simply appear, as though they had always been waiting for someone willing to believe them. The people of the Mississippi Delta told it in a different way. Some claimed the meeting happened beneath a full moon. Others insisted the sky was hidden behind thick storm clouds. A few swore it happened on a night so dark that Robert couldn't even see his own hand. But every version agree on one thing, the crossroads. It's always the crossroads. The old storytellers spoke of a place with quiet respect, not fear, respect. Because they believed there were places in the world where the distance between the ordinary and the impossible was somehow thinner. They believed lonely crossroads belonged to neither road. There were places in between, neither here nor there. That's why they call them a crossroad. And according to the legend, that was where Robert went. He walked until the music from the juke joints had faded into silence, until the last farmhouse had disappeared behind him, until there was nothing left except endless fields stretching beneath a Mississippi sky. The night was unusually still. No breeze, no distant voices, only the steady rhythm of the footsteps against the dry earth. Then the road divided. Two forgotten tracks crossing in the middle of nowhere. Robert stopped. The old stories say he laid his guitar carefully on the ground. Not carelessly, almost respectfully, as though he knew this moment mattered. Then he waited. How long? Nobody ever agreed. Old legends are really interested in clocks. Minutes have passed, perhaps hours. The night revealed nothing. Then, without warning, the silence changed. Not because of a sound, because of the absence of one. The insects stopped singing. The wind disappeared. Even the leaves hanging from the distant trees became perfectly still. The Delta itself seemed to be holding its breath. That was when Robert realised he was no longer alone. A figure stood at a short distance away. No one ever described him quite the same. Some remembered a tall man wearing an immaculate black suit despite the dust of the Delta roads. Others recalled only a broad-brimmed hat hiding his face beneath impossible shadows. One elderly blues musician insisted the stranger's clothes weren't black at all, only that the darkness itself seemed unwilling to leave him. Whatever people believed they had seen, no one ever claimed to recognise the man. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. According to the legend, Robert already knew exactly who was standing before him. Stephen King would call him the walking dude. The stranger looked towards the old guitar resting in the dirt, then slowly he held out his hand. Robert didn't hesitate. He picked up the instrument and placed it gently into the stranger's waiting hands. For several long moments, nothing happened. The man examined the guitar as though he had all the time in the world. And if the rumours and the legends are true, he did. His fingers traced the worn edges of the wood, the polished neck, the steel strings. He smiled. Not with kindness, not with cruelty, with recognition, as though he had seen this same moment unfold countless times before. Then he reached for the tuning peg. A click, one string tightened. Click, another. Click, another. For the final adjustment. Each tiny sound echoed across the empty crossroads with impossible clarity. When he was satisfied, he rested one hand slightly against the string and played. It was a single chord, apparently, just one, that's what the legend says. Yet the old storytellers claimed it didn't sound like a guitar. It sounded like longing, like heartbreak, like every dusty road Robert Johnson had ever walked, like every dream he had refused to abandon. Some said they heard sorrow. Others heard triumph. A few believed they heard something much darker. Perhaps each man heard only what already lived inside his own heart. The stranger handed the guitar back. No contract appeared. No parchments waiting to be signed. No flames rose from the earth. No voice demanded a soul. The older versions of the legend were never interested in such things. They simply say the stranger looked into Robert's eyes and nodded. Then he turned, walked back into the darkness and was gone. Now the insects began singing once more. The wind returned. The crossroads became nothing more than two forgotten roads beneath an endless Mississippi sky. Only Robert remained, standing exactly where he had been before, his guitar resting quietly in his hand. Everything looked the same, yet somehow nothing was. The old storytellers always smiled at this point, not because the story was over, because they believed this was where it truly began. Robert looked down at the guitar, ran his fingers gently across the string, and for the very first time, the music that had always lived inside him finally found its way out. When Robert Johnson returned to the Delta, something had changed, not just in his music, in the people who listened to it. Word travelled quickly through Mississippi in those days, not through newspapers, not over the radio, but from one porch to another, from one juke joint to the next, from one travelling musician meeting another somewhere along a lonely stretch of road. Have you heard about Robert Johnson lately? You wouldn't believe it if I told you. At first, people speak only about the music. How one man can make a guitar sound as though it carried two voices instead of one. How his fingers seemed to move without effort. How every song felt older than the man singing it. Some travelled for miles just to hear him play. Others travelled simply to decide for themselves whether the stories were true, and every audience left asking the very same question. How? How had this happened? The sensible men had sensible answers. He'd been practicing. He found himself a fine teacher. The boy always had determination. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps they are rightly. An old famer claimed he had seen Robert walking along just after sunset. A woman living outside Clarksdale insisted she heard guitar music drifting across the fields long after midnight, even though no one could be seen on the road. A travelling preacher warned his congregation that some gifts carried a price too terrible to imagine. None of these stories can be proven, yet none of them had disappeared. Instead, they grew. Every town added another detail. Every storyteller remembered something slightly different. One old musician swore Robert never looked another guitarist in the eye before he played. Another claimed that dogs always became strangely restless whenever Robert arrived into town. Someone also insisted that if you watched closely enough, the shadows around him seemed just a little darker than everyone else's. Were any of these things true? History has never found an answer. But history wasn't listening in the juke joints after midnight, the legends were. Even Robert's own songs seemed to feed the rumours. He sang of lonely roads, crossroads. Hellhounds followed closely behind. He sang about the devil, temptation. To Robert, they may simply have been powerful images deeply rooted in the religious language and folklore of the American South. But to those already convinced something impossible had happened, the song sounded like a confession hidden inside poetry. Some listeners heard music, others believed they were hearing memories. And perhaps that is why Robert Johnson rarely spoke about the rumours. He never stood before a crowd claiming to have met the devil. He never tried to convince anyone that the legend wasn't true. He simply smiled, adjusted the guitar across his shoulder, and let the music speak for itself. And sometimes silence tells a far better story than words ever could. So years passed. The legend travelled further than Robert Johnson himself. Long before the age of television, long before social media would carry a rumour around the world in seconds, the story had already crossed state lines. Traveller musicians took it north. Record collectors carried it west. Writers added their own versions. By the time Robert's name began appearing in magazines and history books, the young bluesman and the lonely Crossroads had become an impossible to separate. Whether people believed the story or laughed at it no longer mattered. The legend had already become immortal. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Robert Johnson was gone. It appeared during the summer of 1938. He had been performing at a county dance near Greenwood, Mississippi. Some say a jealous husband slipped poison into an open bottle of whiskey. Others believed illness claimed him. The truth, like so much of Robert Johnson's life, disappeared into the shadows. For 3 days he fought for his life, and then on the 16th of August 1938, Robert Johnson died. He was 27 years old. The old musicians buried a friend. The Delta buried one of its greatest blues players, and the Crossroads fell silent. All, so people believe. For many years, the story faded into background. The old bluesman grew older. The juke joint slowly disappeared. The dusty road of the Mississippi remained exactly where it had always been, but fewer people remembered why they had once been feared after dark, and the world moved on. Music changed. The blues gave birth to rock and roll. The lonely acoustic guitar was joined by amplifiers, stadium lights, and screaming crowds. Robert Johnson became less of a man and more of a name hidden deep inside the history of music. It seemed the legend had finally reached its end. But old legends are patient. They don't disappear, they wait. Almost 30 years after Robert Johnson's death, another gifted musician left the world far too soon. Then another, and another. At first, nobody connected them. Why would they? Death is an unfortunate companion to every generation, but as the years passed, the whispers began again. In 1969, Brian Jones, the founding guitarist of the Rolling Stones, died at the age of 27. Just over a year later, Jimi Hendrix, a musician whose extraordinary talent changed the electric guitar forever, also died at 27. Only weeks later, Janis Joplin. Her voice had carried the pain and passion of the blues into a new generation. She too was 27. Then came Jim Morrison, the poet, the rebel, the singer, the voice of the Doors, 27 years old. For a while, people dismissed it as nothing more than a strange coincidence. Perhaps they were right. Of course, history has a habit of producing coincidences that seem far more meaningful than they truly are. But then the years rolled on. A new generation found its own musical icon, Kurt Cobain, the reluctant voice of a generation, again 27. Then in 2011, Amy Winehouse, a voice so timeless it seemed to belong to another age entirely, 27. One name is a tragedy, two names make people pause, but when the list keeps growing, people did what human beings have always done. They look backwards, back through old newspaper cuttings, back through forgotten records, back through fading photographers, until eventually they found themselves standing once more beneath the Mississippi stars, back at the Crossroads, back at Robert Johnson. Only then did the newspapers give it a name. They called it the 27 Club. It wasn't really a club. There were no members, no meetings, no invitations. Only an extraordinary collection of artists whose lives had ended at exactly the same age. Psychologists tell us that the human mind searches endlessly for patterns, and I believe that. We connect events, we build stories, we look for meaning even when coincidence may be the only explanation. Statisticians have studied the so-called 27 Club and found no evidence that 27 is a uniquely dangerous age for musicians. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps they always were. But statistics have never been able to explain why so many stories refuse to leave us. Because legends don't survive inside numbers, they survive inside people. And there's one question that refuses to disappear. It wasn't asked in universities or concert halls or newspaper offices. It was asked in quiet voices, usually late at night, usually after the music had stopped. And the question was always the same. What if Robert Johnson wasn't the end of the story? What if it was only the beginning? No one suggested that Hendrix had stood at a crossroads, or that Janis Joplin had a mysterious stranger beneath the stars. The legend never claimed that. Instead, people wondered whether Robert Johnson had unknowingly become the first chapter in a story that music itself would continue writing. Whether that strange idea holds any truth, no one can say. But every time another remarkable talent left the world too soon, the old legend found new life. And somewhere, far beyond the bright lights of concert arenas and recording studios, the lonely crossroads waited in silence, exactly as always had, as though it knew the story wasn't finished yet. So what do you think? The legend of the crossroads. Are you a supernatural fan? Because they bring that up all the time. Cowley was a great part in the Supernatural series. He did appear first at the crossroads. There is a film called The Crossroads with I don't know his name, I never know any actors, but he was in The Karate Kid. That's a crossroads. He wanted to be a blues player, went to the crossroads. So it's a legend that I love, and I hope you like it too. This was UFOs, aliens and weird stuff. So please like and subscribe, ding that notification bell, and I'll see you on the next story. Thank you.